Hi, my name is Jennifer Mejias. I actually decided to choose the project over food intolerance and food sensitivity among American adults just because I found it very interesting as I was studying this course this month. A lot of people think that food is changing so our bodies aren't able to recognize it anymore, and that maybe the food has been manipulated so much, like GMO, or has been processed so much that our body is seeing it as more of a toxin or as a foreign element that our body's unable to digest it. However, as I did some research, that isn't necessarily the case. I felt this was an interesting topic for me personally, simply because I have food intolerance issues and I struggled for years with chronic diarrhea, chronic gas, bloating, nausea, throwing up after eating sometimes, and I didn't know what it was. So I went to the doctor and continued to complain about my symptoms, and I did about 7 tests. They tested mechanically, maybe there's an obstruction. I got a colonoscopy and endoscopy. The only thing they found was hiatal hernia, which would explain the acid reflux and the nausea and vomiting if that pressure was filled. And then I took other tests that diagnosed me with fructose and lactose intolerant. But I really did need a food intolerance test, but my insurance doesn't cover it. I'm not sure that there is really a food intolerance test, but rather food allergy tests. But the difference between food allergies and food intolerance is something that we are definitely going to cover in my paper as well as my presentation here. For my first slide, I want to just introduce the difference between food allergies and food intolerances as well as food sensitivity. Food intolerance is synonymous to food hypersensitivity. Hypersensitivity is basically explaining how the body works, because food allergy deals more with the immunological mechanism, so that involves the immune system and the immune system's response to the food item eaten, whereas food intolerance as well as food hypersensitivity is more of a metabolic issue, digestive issue, and they show different symptoms. I included this slide so you can see how the immune system works against a certain food item. So this is more dealing with food allergies. Food allergies is more endogenous, whereas food intolerance happens to be more exogenous symptoms, because food allergy deals with more like the histamines, and therefore they have atopic symptoms, and usually that can be quite fatal. That deals with hives, respiratory issues. But when it comes to food intolerance, it's objectively reproducible symptoms, so that makes it more difficult to pinpoint the trigger foods. But as you can see here, food intolerance has more symptoms, as I spoke of personally, my personal issues, like nausea, diarrhea, gas and bloating, as well as headaches. However, these are rather inconsistent. Sometimes you think, oh, it's milk that's bothering me, but you'll end up eating bread later on and you're still having the same issues, or you don't get as sick next time you drink the milk. And it's rather gradual. Whereas with food allergies, once you eat, shellfish that you're allergic to, you immediately experience the allergic reaction. Again, when it comes to food intolerance, it's hard to diagnose simply because it's gradual and inconsistent. So typically people are misdiagnosed with having IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, as well as gastritis, diverticulosis, just a lot of symptoms that doctors aren't used to seeing within food intolerance. They will put it with another issue. But if you continue to misdiagnose and completely ignore the intolerant reaction towards certain foods, other health issues may end up occurring later on. Just because symptoms may not be immediately life-threatening like they are with food allergies, you have to remember that the GI homeostasis is completely affected for the worst. Basically, the entire GI system is irritated. So over time, as it continues to be irritated, the body's response to the certain food item trigger is affected by the health of the entire GI system, not just the food item itself. So basically, you see this within celiac disease. People with celiac disease, as they continue to eat gluten, not knowing that they have celiac disease, they'll continue to inflame their GI tract, and all the microvilli are struggling to absorb all the minerals, so they tend to lose weight. Once they remove gluten from their diet, their GI is able to heal, and therefore they're able to absorb their food again, and typically they end up gaining the good weight back because they lost so much as they were trying to digest something that was causing such a dramatic effect on their GI system. So when it comes to someone who is eating, let's say, drinking a lot of dairy and they're lactose intolerant, as they continue to put lactose into their system and continue to irritate their GI system, their GI becomes completely sensitive to many other foods that they aren't typically intolerant to, but the GI system is so sensitive that they start having other digestive system issues because their digestive system at this point is compromised. So at this point, when it becomes so severe, symptoms become frequent and they become chronic. So this makes it even more difficult the more you experience this issue over time without getting help. It becomes more difficult for doctors as well as yourself to figure out what is the cause and what is the trigger. So you also have to keep in mind that the GI tract is a major agent in immunity. So having an imbalance of that causes an effect on the immunity and also weakens the immune system. So not only that, but you're not absorbing all the materials as you should be, like your vitamins and your minerals. So you'll also experience malabsorption. So that's malnutrition, as well as weight loss, because you're not obtaining any of the good vitamins and minerals that it's necessary for you to function. Lastly, as you are having a compromised immunity, you will become also very vulnerable to other illnesses that may just be passing your way, as in the common cold, or maybe a virus that is going around like strep throat. I think the biggest concern that I have about this issue is that there's very little research on food intolerance in the United States. All that I found for my paper was in other countries. Many other countries. So it was actually very sad that I couldn't even put a statistic as to how many people are struggling with this issue other than myself. In fact, all the statistics were from other countries like Australia, Sweden, the Netherlands, as well as the United Kingdom. The scary fact of that is that with little research, there's little evidence, which means that there's fewer treatments as well as diagnoses, like how to diagnose the issue if you can't even know what to look for. But with the little research that I was able to obtain, they believe it is actually due to the possibility of 5 things. These 5 things basically make up my hypothesis, that the following things are the reasons why we experience food intolerance here in the United States. The first being chemical additives and processed foods. And the second is a low digestible carbohydrate intake. The third is metabolic toxins produced from food. The fourth is having a weak immune system. And the fifth thing is deficiency in fiber, dietary fiber. However, the worst one of all, and what I conclude, is the second, being low digestible carbohydrate intake. Now, the top food allergy foods are milk, eggs, and wheat. But remember, food intolerance is different. The top food intolerance foods are actually milk, gluten, and the amino acids like tyramine. Now, the reason it's not about processed foods or the chemical additives is because most of the food intolerance cases are actually with natural ingredients in food, as in lactose with milk, citric acid within some fruits, or casein, which is actually the protein in eggs. So like we've discussed earlier, it's not about chemical additives, that food is changing, that our body is unable to detect that processed food is real food. I actually thought that that was going to be the main case, and it's turning out that my hypothesis is in fact that it's carbohydrate. Now with someone who has food intolerance, I do completely fine with carbohydrates. Certain ones, of course, I'm fructose intolerant, and I do seem to be very, very sensitive to certain sugars. But using the 2008 study, they selected 27 adults with abdominal pains they thought was due to food hypersensitivity. And then they also added healthy adults to be used as controls. Both sets of people were given glucose, which was going to be the placebo, and it's more of an easily digestible carbohydrate. They were also then given lactulose, which is a more difficult carbohydrate sugar to digest. It turns out that only the food intolerant subjects showed intolerance to lactulose, and it also, side note, that they also found out that 25 out of the 27 subjects turned out to have irritable bowel syndrome. This study also seems to explain a little bit of the metabolic toxin hypothesis as well, because they also explain that hydrogen and methane are usually the metabolites that are produced by the bacteria in the large intestine when digesting carbohydrates. Now, the food intolerant subjects over time produced more hydrogen by digesting lactulose than glucose compared to the healthy subjects. But when it came to methane production, both groups had similar amount of methane with lactulose and glucose over time. However, when it comes to the 2010 study, they wanted to look into these metabolites a little bit further because they believe metabolites are actually the metabolic toxins. This study really does focus on the metabolic toxins because they believe that these symptoms are a result of the small intestine being unable to digest these carbohydrates, which then sends this undigested amount of foods and undigested carbohydrates to the large intestine, which has over 100,000 more bacterial cells compared to the small intestine. However, there is no oxygen in the large intestine, and if there is, it's just very little actually. So when it comes to glycolysis to produce ATP, the body needs to get rid of hydrogen and carbohydrates to be digested, but it can't release it as the molecule water, H2O, because there's no oxygen, O2, to be present. So through hydrogen gas and other metabolites are actually produced, and that kind of explains the certain metabolites that they are referring to as toxic. So if you look at this picture here, it explains just that. It shows what kind of bacteria is able to do during glycolysis to produce ATP. You can see that another metabolite that they find to be the most potent toxin is the methylglycoxyl. Now, methylglycoxyl actually affects eukaryotic cells, and so this study also found other reviews that say it actually inhibits bacterial cell growth, which actually ends up affecting digestion if it limits the amount of bacteria within the digestion system. So these metabolites affect balance of microflora of the large intestine, when the gut is the most important thing for immunity and health. So this study actually seeps into the reason why it can't be the immune system that causes food intolerance, but rather food intolerance causes a weakened immune system, because it can't be the other way around. Now, I know that there are many of us who struggle with IBS-related or similar symptoms, but maybe you can relate to me on this as well. Whenever I go to someone who specializes in, gastrology, or someone who's very into nutrition and health and just the diet, and I tell them what I'm struggling with, they typically always ask, have you tried probiotics? Of course I've tried probiotics, but it didn't help. But the majority of people suggest, oh, you just need to increase your fiber intake. In fact, I was reading a study that it turns out that 95% of doctors truly believe that irritable bowel syndrome symptoms are actually a result of being deficient in dietary fiber. Now, the funny thing about that is the study continues to look at irritable bowel syndrome patients versus those who are healthy without irritable bowel syndrome whatsoever. It turns out that they were given several sources of fiber, and 11% of the IBS patients showed absolutely no improvement. There was no change. Nothing really happened. But it turns out that 55% of the IBS patients showed symptoms that actually caused way more issues. And that is exactly what happened to me. I thought maybe it's because I need to have insoluble fiber, not soluble fiber, or maybe I need soluble, because my symptoms actually got worse. They also discovered in this that 90% of all subjects, that includes those without IBS, they actually showed a malabsorption of at least one sugar from the fiber sources. So, but it turns out that the symptom scores of the IBS patients were significantly higher compared to the non-IBS subjects. Now, patients could be, or the patients that have IBS could be experiencing worse symptoms from fiber because, again, they aren't able to digest many of the carbohydrate or low digestible sugars within the fiber products, because we know that a lot of things that are high in fiber are particularly higher in carbohydrates, like whole grains and things that are more on the carbohydrate levels. So that's the only reason why it's actually associated as an issue. It's not the fiber in itself. And as you can see in this picture, that when someone does have a food intolerance and they continue to eat the food, this is exactly how inflamed your stomach becomes, and you're filled with gas, you're completely bloated, and it is very, very, very uncomfortable. I actually look like this as well, and it becomes actually incredibly painful over time. That it turns out that fiber, no probiotics, nothing along those lines will be beneficial to me. It turns out that when I eliminated fructose and citric acid for my acid reflux and dairy, I felt significantly a lot better, and I actually have just basically dropped all the symptoms that I was used to dealing with for many, many years. Now, what I came up with after doing plenty of research, it turns out that the real issue is that there is not enough research on food intolerance, and it is a big health issue. The biggest problem about not having food intolerance research is that doctors these days actually coin food intolerance, other than calling it food intolerance, they call it food idiosyncrasy as well as pseudo-allergy, when it really is a health problem. It's not a trivial issue. It's legitimate and actually very hard to live a fulfilled life. It's very limiting. With that said, if there was more research done, then doctors will be able to learn the symptoms, what to look for, and ways to diagnose these patients, as well as be able to do really good treatment. But until then, it's best that doctors start to recommend these clients and patients to register dietitians because they can give the best diet recommendations. So, just listening to dietitians and educating them on these issues, they'll basically say to limit foods to food items that are the least processed, and to decrease hard to digest carbohydrates that actually makes it really hard to digest sugars. So the main focus is the main sugar that we really need and is the easiest to digest is glucose in itself. Also, avoid foods that have no nutritional value whatsoever. If you're struggling with chronic diarrhea and you're losing a lot of nutrients to malabsorption issues, you want food that is happy in your tummy and allows you to receive the fullest vitamins and minerals that you can possibly have. And lastly, when it comes to healing, letting your body heal completely before you try doing any elimination diets, because it can trigger, your stomach can trigger at any time with any kind of food, which will actually confuse you as to what are you most sensitive towards, which food is actually upsetting me, because they are very inconsistent symptoms. Alright, and I just wanted to show one last thing. It's very important as dietitians that we encourage food intolerance as well as food allergy awareness, because this is becoming an increased issue over the decades. And it's not necessarily because our food is being manipulated by man. such as GMO, is what I mentioned earlier. It's not necessarily because the grains, like the wheat belly book, it's not about our body is not able to digest new grains because it's not the same as it was back when the cavemen were around. It's really about our own digestive issues. It could be our environment, it could be genetics, but honestly, we don't know because there's not enough research. So until then, as dietitians, we are able to help these people who struggle the most and really want to have an overall healthy lifestyle that isn't limited to a restricted food or diet because they're scared that it will trigger them at any moment. Here are my 10 references for the literature review, and I hope that you liked my presentation and that you can help spread the awareness for food intolerance as well as food insensitivity. Thank you. Good luck.